Hello and welcome to the Music Professor channel. I'm Matthew King and I'm here with my able assistant Loki. We're here to talk about Schumann's Träumerie. Ian and I created a film a few weeks ago about Träumerie, but today I want to talk a little bit more about this extraordinarily beautiful piece and how it fits into the Kinderszenen cycle which he composed in 1838. It's an extraordinarily wonderful thing that he did with Kinderszenen. It's really a song cycle without words. The Mendelssohns, I should credit both Fanny Mendelssohn and Felix Mendelssohn because they kind of did it together. They invented a genre called the song without words in the late 1820s when they were very young. And the idea of the song without words is a very simple idea, but no one had ever quite come up with it before. It's the idea of a song-like piece with a beautiful melody, like a vocal melody, but composed specifically for the piano. Very much a sort of archetypical genre of the new Romantic movement.
Her name is Rio and she dances on the sand.
And Schumann, though he never actually called anything Song Without Words, knowing that the title was really already established by the Mendelssohns, by Felix in particular, because Felix was writing book after book of Song Without Words in the 1830s. Schumann wrote something different, which is really a song cycle without words, a whole set of tiny miniatures in the form of little songs, each one. And this was in a very turbulent period of Schumann's life, when he and his sort of secretly betrothed future wife, Clara, were separated, forcibly separated by Clara's father. It's very complicated. He'd been piano teacher to both of them, to both Schumann and to Clara. And Clara was his daughter, and she was sort of like a child prodigy, a kind of Mozartian child who had extraordinary musical gifts, and her father had promoted her from a very early age, so that she was already at the age of 10 out on the concert circuit and destined for a life as a travelling virtuoso, which indeed is what she became, one of the most famous virtuoso pianists of the 19th century. When they were finally married in 1840, Robert Schumann, had to kind of play second fiddle to his wife, which was a very unusual thing in the 19th century. She was the main breadwinner, she was the more celebrated artist, and Robert, her husband, amazing composer though he was less famous, less established. In the 1830s, when they were still not married, but kind of corresponding and meeting secretly occasionally, she kind of berated Robert and said, look, you need to compose some pieces that are more popular in style. You really need to engage with your public. Write some longer pieces. She gave him these instructions about how he needed to just go out there and be a bit more interactive with popular taste. Schumann never found this easy because he was an artist. You know, he was just a wonderful, introspective, creative mind who just wanted to do his own thing. And he was a very kind of self-reflective. Well, he had mental illness problems, that's the first thing to say, but he was also extremely, very moody. When he was a young journalist, he created two persona for himself. One was called Eusebius, who was the dreamy, introspective part of his creative personality, and the other was Florestan, who was a much more forthright, passionate side of his character. So he had both. Has he been doing that for some time?
1 minute later.
So, Florestan was the more romantic, passionate part of Schumann's character. But I think the part of Schumann that was on regular display socially, because he wasn't a very sociable person, was the more introspective, rather quiet, thoughtful side. And it was only when he was with close friends, Felix Mendelssohn was one of them, Clara, of course, was a close friend, that he could really be himself and interact in a more happy way. Richard Wagner famously came to visit him in the 1830s, having come back from Paris, and they had this conversation, which is quite funny to read about because both of them wrote about it afterwards. Robert Schumann said, had a conversation with Wagner. He's a very intelligent, very well-educated guy with a lot of spirit. But my goodness, he can't stop talking. How irritating is that? And Wagner, in a letter that he wrote at the same time, says sort of the opposite. I found Robert Schumann completely impossible. He never says a word. So you get this sense, not just from that account, but from others, of a person very much wrapped up in his own thoughts. And this idea of somebody introspective and consumed in their own thinking and not really able to communicate very easily is in the background of a piece like Träumerie, a piece about reverie and introspection, and very much the Eusebius side of Schumann's personality, creative personality, the dreamy side. So the next thing to say about this piece is it's very, very famous. It's been used almost more than any other piece of music in numerous films as a kind of romantic trope, a sort of symbol of love. Not only that, it's also a piece that has a sort of legendary place within the piano repertoire. Certain pianists, the famous Vladimir Horowitz, used to use it as an encore, as a sort of party piece, which was rather marvellous because Horowitz was famously brilliant virtuoso, but Träumerie was the piece that he'd wheel out as a sort of representation of his poetic skills. And he was such a beautiful performer of the music that he would sometimes begin to weep himself while he was playing it. And certainly audiences would also well up while he was playing. And we'll hear a little bit of his performance of it, which is very, very much under the tempo that Schumann originally indicated in the score. We'll get onto tempo in a minute. But it's so beautiful and so poetic that it's a wonder. So it's not only a piece that's been used frequently in the history of film, almost more than any other piece of music. It's also a piece that's been much debated in musicological circles, particularly in a famous argument that took place in print between two composers, two German composers in the 20th century. One was Hans Pfitzner and the other was Alban Berg, who wrote the opera Wozzeck and another opera Lulu and many other marvellous pieces, pupil of Schoenberg. Pfitzner's contention was that you couldn't analyse Träumerie. It was a piece of music that simply existed as an example of pure inspiration. There was no way that you could analyse it except to appreciate it for what it was, something absolutely spontaneous and perfect, but unanalysable. If you analysed it, he said, you can't find anything, you can't find any reason beyond the fact that it is a thing of beauty in itself, that sort of idea. Alban Berg responded by saying, of course you can analyse it, and in fact, its very spontaneity, its inspiration, is detectable if you start to analyse it. You can start to see why it's so good, so beautiful. So it became this debate between the two of them. And in a minute, I'll do a short analysis. And then at the end, you'll see the annotated music, which also gives a short analysis. The next thing to talk about is tempos. This is an interesting topic because I am very anti-fundamentalist about tempo. I'll give you an example. Beethoven, when the metronome was invented, was very keen for a period in putting metronome markings into his pieces. But it's well known from contemporary sources who heard Beethoven perform that he would often start a piece in a certain tempo and then modify the tempo as he went along. He himself said that the tempo marking was only an indicator of how the piece should start. Schumann, interestingly, when he wrote Kinderszenen in 1838, he put metronome markings over each movement. It's quite a radical thing. In fact, he doesn't give a tempo marking, he simply gives a metronome mark. And a fascinating thing, and some commentators on the channel have pointed this out, and it's really interesting, is that the metronome markings, as so often in that period, seem much quicker than we're used to now, because the performance tradition, the whole late Romantic performance tradition, and then the 20th century performance tradition on top of that, has slowed and slowed these tempi down. But I'm not convinced that even Schumann, Clara, it would seem, certainly played them differently from the metronome markings, because when she edited a second edition of these pieces later, after Schumann's death, she removed the metronome markings. So metronome markings are interesting, and they do give an indication, but only an indication about tempo. But the fascinating thing is Träumerie, the original tempo indication is 100 BPM, so that's 100 is that, which means we've got this as the tempo. I might try playing the whole thing at that tempo, but it's very unusual. I'm actually going to play the whole thing at 100 BPM, but I'll miss out the repeat because we'll have the whole piece at the end. But just so you get a sense of what Schumann's own metronome mark would have been, or was, Shall I get Loki to come back in? So I'm afraid that performance in Schumann's original tempo did not please Loki, and he's left the room. But that gives you a slight indication of how the piece originally may have been felt by the composer, but of course the subsequent performance tradition has tended to slow it right down. And I think there are reasons for that connected with this sort of almost spiritual character the piece has, this wonderful kind of floating atmosphere, and the reverie, the sense of introspection and dreaminess that it has. As Alban Berg pointed out, Träumerie has a crucial position in the Kinderszenen cycle. Kinderszenen is a cycle of 13 pieces, and sometime I might try and do all the pieces and talk about each one because it's so fascinating. But this is the 7th, so it comes right in the middle, like a kind of pivot point, the hinge down the middle of the cycle. And it's in F major, so it's the one point at which it goes into a flat key. This and the piece that comes after it are in F major, and then it turns back to the sharp side of the circle of fifths. But this is the sort of introspective point, the flat point in the cycle, the hinge, and the kind of spiritual centre, or the still point at the centre of the cycle. It's all very interesting, isn't it? And it contains 8 phrases if you count the repeat. So the opening phrase, and then a kind of answer phrase, both of which go to C, although the second modulates to C. And the fascinating thing is, we start every phrase with a fourth, a rising fourth, almost like a sort of I am, a kind of this is where we are kind of feel about it. The rising fourth into, like it has a cadential character. It shouldn't work. 8 times to do that seems dangerous in a short piece. Just to sit down each time, but there we are, that's the nature of genius. It sits down and then it picks up again. The extension of that fourth is a sort of wonderful decorated, almost like a flower, like an organic variation up to the higher fourth, but the whole thing is like a variation of the opening fourth. So you've got the open fourth, the decorated fourth to the higher F, but harmonised with the subdominant, which is a beautiful, simple but beautiful change of harmony. And then the falling response in little 3 steps down, 3 steps up, 3 steps up again, this time with horn chords, which is a kind of romantic topic. The idea of horns kind of in the distance, it's a common theme in romantic music. You can hear them just calling in the distance, and then this lovely turn back to the second phrase. The other thing that's really interesting is the rhythm. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3. Or at least that's how I would view it, as a sort of division. You're dividing up your 4/4 bars into sort of different phrase lengths of 5 and 3. Some people would view it differently and simply say the second bar of each phrase is offset onto the second beat. I mean, that's fine if that's the way you want to view it, but it feels to me like 5s and 3s, a kind of beautiful irregularity. The third phrase again is in 5 beats, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's the first beat of the next bar, and the second beat, the beautiful change. Alban Berg pointed out that every single phrase is harmonised differently. Isn't that fascinating? So the first phrase, when it reaches the apex, is B flat. The second is A7. And then as you go on to the next one after the repeat, we have this sort of very sad, melancholy dissonance to G minor. The next one, the same thing pulling us towards D minor, and then the recap. We come back to our original harmony for that one, but the last one, the most beautiful of all, is this gorgeous secondary dominant, which is very interestingly harmonised. You'd think it wouldn't work. A low third in the left hand, it's like Stravinsky this, doubled an octave higher, and then this huge chord, F, G, D, A. It's a great big ninth at the top. Really fantastic, a fantastic spacing. sort of transcendental, really. And then it cadences at the end. It runs down. Now, the next thing to say, that's a little bit of a digression just to show you the different harmonizations of the phrase each time. So, okay, let's just go from the beginning one more time. Chord 4, the horn call, and then we go to the dominant, and then the answer beautifully goes to A7, which takes us to the relative minor, and then cadences in C. Now, these falling phrases are lovely because they're really almost like a string quartet. First violin, second violin, viola, and then cello at the bottom, so you have this beautiful little sort of cobweb or tracery of counterpoint. It's so effortless, and you hardly notice the beauty of the contrapuntal thinking that's going on here. Next phrase is the one I mentioned a minute ago, with this melancholy turn to G minor. And here we go, here's our quartet-like dropping down to bottom B flat, which of course B flat was the second chord of the piece here, so B flat's a sort of topic in the piece, the subdominant, and then that turns towards, in a very tragic way, to D minor, and then the counterpoints run down again. I think this may be the first piece I know in music history that has the seventh just sitting there at the base of the chord, and then a little grace note, and then back into the tune. So somehow that last inversion of the seventh, and then that leads almost immediately into the recap. It's a very surprising chord spacing with the seventh resolving to the A there. So that comes down from the seventh to the A in the next chord. And then this phrase is the same as the opening, with a horn call again. And then the final phrase is the best of all. And here we go to this wonderful secondary dominant with the ninth at the top. I think that this is a cipher. Schumann was obsessed with ciphers and he used them all his life. He has a bunch of tunes that represent Clara, but this, I think, literally is Clara. It's C-A-A, the three musical letters in her name. C-A-A, so it's as if all this reverie is about, hardly surprisingly since they were separated, is about her. And underneath it, this wonderful chord with a pause over the top, almost infinitely. You can hold it forever. And then finally it repeats that with the horn call and then cadences. One last thing to say about this. There is, of course, out of this a whole tradition of reveries of various kinds in music. One brief thing to say is that I think the whole French Impressionist movement owed a great deal to Schumann. He was one of Debussy's favourite composers, for example. Debussy was a big Schumann fan. And I think it's interesting that Debussy's Reverie of the 1890s is also in F major and is also concerned with fourths. Schumann has raised fourths, whereas Debussy has falling fourths. And also that there's this rhythmic disconnect. A bit like in Schumann, the rhythms don't quite, you've got sort of syncopations in the left hand with these falling fourths, and the rhythms are all slightly dislocated. There's falling bass line and then the famous harmonization is suddenly in D minor. So the fourth that Schumann has immortalized as a sort of symbol of reverie continues into the sort of compositional fabric, if you like, of subsequent music. So there we are. Enjoy Schumann's Träumerie, a miracle of piano composition from the 1830s.